Prince Adrian had never heard the word no in his life. He had never said please, never thanked a servant, and never listened when his parents scolded him. He was the loudest, rudest, and most entitled royal in the entire kingdom. His parents, the king and queen, had tried everything: lectures, punishments, even bribery, but nothing worked. Adrian simply did what he wanted, whenever he wanted. One evening, after an especially disastrous royal banquet, where Adrian had thrown his soup at a duke and called the ambassador from the neighboring kingdom a pompous goat, his parents made their decision. They sent him away to the one place they thought would teach him a lesson: the kingdom of no manners. Adrian, however, saw no punishment in this. A kingdom where everyone behaved like him? Where rules were ignored, respect was unnecessary, and no one scolded him. He welcomed it with open arms, certain he was about to enter paradise. Little did he know, he had made a terrible mistake. The moment Adrian stepped into the kingdom of no manners, he was overwhelmed. It was a place unlike any other. Buildings leaned at odd angles, covered in graffiti. The streets were littered with discarded food and broken objects. People shouted instead of speaking, shoved instead of walking, and argued instead of conversing. At first, Adrian loved it. Nobody told him to sit up straight. Nobody reminded him to say, "Thank you." When he grabbed food from a vendor without paying, nobody batted an eye. It was everything he had ever wanted. But soon, cracks began to appear in his perfect world. When he tried to take a carriage, the driver refused to acknowledge him. When he demanded a room at an inn, the owner ignored him completely. When he shouted at a servant to bring him water, they rolled their eyes and walked away. For the first time in his life, he realized a horrifying truth. Without respect, no one listened. Without rules, nothing functioned. And worst of all, in a land where everyone was rude, he was just another voice in the noise. Days passed, and Adrian found himself struggling. He had no proper food, no servants to attend to him, and no place to sleep that wasn't constantly stolen from him. He had thought he was the best at being rude, but here he was just average. He tried to take charge. He demanded attention, issued orders, even attempted to seize the throne. But the king of no manners was worse than he was. A man who threw tantrums instead of ruling, who ignored problems rather than solving them. Nobody obeyed anyone. The kingdom was in chaos, and Adrian was powerless in it. For the first time in his life, he felt something unfamiliar. Frustration, not at others, but at himself. He had always believed that being the loudest, the most demanding, was the way to win. But here, it got him nothing. He had to find another way. Determined to escape this nightmare, Adrian did something he had never done before. He watched. He listened. He saw how people ignored one another, how nothing got done, how even the king's commands went unheard. And he realized something. If no one respected anyone, then no one had power. That meant, if he wanted people to listen to him, he had to be different. He had to earn respect. So, with great difficulty, Adrian tried something new. He said please when asking for food. He helped a shopkeeper clean up spilled fruit. He even, though it nearly killed him, thanked someone who gave him directions. At first, people laughed at him. But then, something strange happened. People listened. Shopkeepers started serving him. He was given a place to sleep. He had done the unthinkable. He had made himself important in a kingdom where no one was. Now that he had found the secret, Adrian set his sights on a greater goal: fixing the kingdom. It was no longer just about escaping. It was about proving to himself that he could change the world around him. He started small. He showed kindness in a place where it was absent. He helped the lost, assisted the struggling, and greeted people with courtesy. People, curious at first, started following his example. A shopkeeper who had once shouted at customers tried speaking calmly. A knight who had ignored everyone started listening. The kingdom, slowly, began to shift. But the king of no manners was furious. He thrived in chaos, and Adrian was ruining everything. He declared Adrian a traitor and sentenced him to be exiled to the dreaded swamp of shouting trolls. Adrian, however, had one last trick up his sleeve. Instead of fighting back with insults and tantrums, Adrian did something shocking. He bowed. He addressed the king respectfully. He calmly made his case, explaining how order, even a little, could make life easier for everyone. The people listened. The king, realizing he was losing his influence, grew desperate. He tried to rile up the crowd, but for the first time, they didn't shout with him. Adrian had won. With the kingdom shifting towards change, a portal opened. His way back home. The kingdom had taught him a lesson, and now it was time to return. As he stepped through the portal, he glanced back at the land he had helped change. It was still chaotic, still wild, but now it had hope. Back in his own kingdom, Adrian was a different person. He treated servants with respect, spoke to his parents with courtesy, and even, on occasion, said, "Please," without being prompted. He wasn't perfect, but he was learning. And though he had returned, a part of him always wondered what became of the kingdom of no manners. Perhaps one day he would return as its rightful king. Nate had never lifted a finger in his life. Servants dressed him, cooked for him, even put toothpaste on his toothbrush. He didn't say, "Please," didn't say, "Thank you." And if anything was slightly inconvenient, he threw a tantrum loud enough to shake the chandeliers. His parents, exhausted from his behavior, sat in their grand dining hall one evening, watching Nate scream about his eggs being too round. They had tried everything: discipline, bribes, expensive therapy, but nothing worked. Desperate, they made a wish, their voices barely above a whisper. We wish Nate knew what it was like to serve others. Somewhere in the vast universe, something stirred. That night, as Nate snored in his oversized silk-sheeted bed, a ripple of magic passed through his room, distorting reality like a wave on a still lake. The chandeliers flickered, the golden furniture shimmered, and just like that, the wish took hold. Morning came. Nate stretched, yawned, and blinked at the ceiling. Something felt off. The bed beneath him was hard and scratchy. The air smelled like cleaning supplies. Confused, he sat up, and his confusion turned into horror. His enormous bedroom was gone. Instead, he was in a small, windowless servant's quarters. The walls were bare, the bed stiff, and beside him lay an old, patched-up uniform. Panic clawed at his throat. He stumbled out the door and into a hallway that looked like his house, but different. The chandeliers were dimmer, the floors slightly scuffed, the air filled with the distant sound of clanging dishes. But the most terrifying thing of all was what he saw next. Himself, or rather, a version of himself, strutting down the grand staircase in a robe, barking orders at the terrified servants. Nate gasped. His own spoiled self was now the master of the house. And he was the butler. Reality crashed down on Nate like a landslide. He tried to protest, to declare his identity, but no one listened. The servants only scoffed, shoving a tray into his hands and telling him to hurry up before Master Nate had a meltdown. The next few hours were a nightmare. He burned his hand serving breakfast. He tripped over expensive rugs. He was yelled at for being too slow, too clumsy, too everything. Every rude thing he had ever done to his staff, every tantrum, every insult, was now happening to him. His spoiled alter ego threw a fit about the temperature of his juice. Nate was ordered to carry his shoes to him, only for Master Nate to complain they weren't shiny enough. And the worst part? No one cared about his suffering. Just as he had once dismissed his servants, they now dismissed him. For the first time in his life, Nate understood what it meant to be powerless. Desperate to undo the nightmare, Nate searched for answers. He scoured the house for signs of magic, begged the other servants for help, even tried sneaking out, only to find the gates wouldn't open for him. Then, he heard a whisper. In the dark corners of the house, behind an old curtain, he found an antique mirror. The moment he touched it, a familiar voice echoed through the glass. The genie. A wish was made, and a wish must be earned. You have taken much. Now, you must give. The message was clear. If he wanted to return to his life, he had to change. At first, Nate resisted. He still believed he could outsmart the curse, that there had to be a shortcut. But as the days passed, something shifted. He saw the exhaustion on the servants' faces, the quiet way they suffered. He began to realize just how much work went into running a household he had taken for granted. And then, something stranger happened. He started helping. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to. He scrubbed dishes without complaining. He helped carry heavy trays. He even stopped Master Nate from throwing a tantrum at the cook, redirecting his anger elsewhere. The other servants noticed. They started treating him differently. For the first time in his life, Nate earned respect. One night, as he helped an old gardener carry a heavy sack, a golden light shimmered through the air. A ripple passed over him, and he gasped. His hands, no longer rough. His uniform, fading away. The world twisted, bent, and then, Nate bolted upright in bed. His real bed. His silk sheets were back, his enormous bedroom restored. It was over. He was home. But something had changed. He sat up, noticing for the first time how grand and unnecessary everything was. The thought of yelling for a servant to fetch his breakfast made his stomach turn. Downstairs, his parents were waiting. They watched him closely, half expecting a tantrum. Instead, Nate did something he had never done before. He thanked the servant who handed him his plate. And when he saw the gardener struggling outside, he didn't hesitate. He went to help. Landon had never met a person he couldn't insult. He saw kindness as weakness, humility as a joke, and respect as something meant only for him. As the crown prince, he treated servants like furniture, nobles like pawns, and commoners like insects. His words were sharp, cruel, and always loud enough for everyone to hear. One day, during a royal procession through the village, a frail old man, hunched with age, stepped onto the path and begged for a coin. His tattered robes barely clung to his body, his hands trembling from years of hardship. Landon sneered. "Get out of my sight, you filthy sack of bones! You smell worse than the royal stables!" A hush fell over the crowd. The old man raised his head, and his cloudy eyes gleamed with something unnatural. "A prince's words are powerful," he rasped. "Perhaps it's time you learned just how much." That night, as Landon slept in his luxurious bed, a strange wind swept through his chambers. Unseen whispers curled around him, carrying words he had spoken, each insult looping back in his ears. His own voice, mocking, jeering, filled his dreams. And then, silence. He woke to a world forever changed. Morning light streamed through the windows as Landon sat up, rubbing his temples. He was about to call for his servants when he noticed something peculiar. His voice felt strange, as though the words had to fight their way out of his mouth. Ignoring the discomfort, he stormed into the dining hall. The royal feast awaited him. Golden bread, roasted meats, and steaming fruit pies. He scoffed. "What is this slop? I wouldn't feed this to a rat." The moment the words left his lips, the feast withered. The bread turned to dust, the meat blackened with mold, and the pies collapsed into pools of rancid sludge. The stench filled the air, making even the servants gag. Landon recoiled. Was this some cruel prank? He turned to the steward, a timid man with shaking hands. "You! Why are you standing there like a frightened chicken?" A terrible sensation swept through him. His limbs tightened, his arms felt shorter. He looked down. His fingers had shrunk, his nails curling inward. His body had lost inches. Panic seized him. He barked at his guards. "You useless buffoons, do something!" Another jolt. He shrank again. His royal garments drooped on his frame, now slightly too big. Horror dawned on him. His words were no longer weapons. They were a curse. Landon's attempts to stop speaking lasted only an hour. Silence was unbearable. He was a prince, after all. He had never been ignored, never gone unheard. He tried whispering, but even soft insults shrank him further. If he tried to praise something sarcastically, the curse twisted his words into truth. He fled to the castle's great library, scouring ancient texts for answers. Every curse had a counter-curse, didn't it? He found no solutions, only grim reminders of magic's fairness. The punishment always fit the crime. The servants avoided his gaze. The guards hesitated before obeying. Word of the prince's affliction spread through the kingdom like wildfire. As he wandered the halls in frustration, he stubbed his toe on a chair. Pain flared, and he snarled at it. "You worthless chunk of wood!" The chair instantly crumbled into splinters. Realization crashed over him. His words didn't just hurt himself. They reshaped the world. Days passed, and Landon barely spoke. But the curse lingered, waiting. He tried to issue orders without insults, but his frustration betrayed him. He belittled a knight's stance, and the man's legs gave out. He scoffed at a maid's clumsiness, and she tripped over nothing. Fear ruled the castle now, thicker than the tapestries lining the walls. The king and queen, desperate to save their son, summoned healers, priests, and magicians. None could undo the old man's work. Only the sorcerer himself could lift the spell. But he was nowhere to be found. Landon's body continued to shrink. His fingers barely wrapped around a goblet now. His voice had grown thinner. His clothes had to be resized daily. He was running out of time. One evening, Landon found himself in the castle gardens, the only place where silence felt bearable. A gardener, old and bent like the beggar he had mocked, was planting flowers. Landon watched, feeling the weight of his own foolishness pressing down. The gardener struggled to lift a pot. An instinct took over. Landon stepped forward and helped. No insults, no commands, just action. Something stirred. A warmth spread through him, faint but real. His hands looked bigger. The realization was slow but undeniable. The curse wasn't just about speaking less, it was about speaking better. Words held power, and his had only ever caused harm. That night, he spoke for the first time with purpose. To the steward, he offered thanks. To the guards, he apologized. To the servants, he gave gratitude. Each kind word restored what had been lost. Landon woke feeling different. His body was whole again. His voice was stronger. The curse had lifted. The next day, a familiar figure appeared at the castle gates. The old man. But he was no beggar. The sorcerer stood tall, eyes gleaming with approval. "You understand now," the sorcerer said, his voice echoing in Landon's mind without sound. Landon bowed, not out of fear, but respect. The sorcerer smiled and vanished into the wind. From that day forward, the kingdom knew a different Landon. His words no longer cut. They built. And the kingdom flourished under the reign of a prince who had finally learned the power of kindness.
If you like this video, then do subscribe to this channel.